Well, we are talking about Anselm of Canterbury. He was a theologian who is significant in terms of the flow of church history. And as we've talked about before, at this stage we're moving north. Christianity, when we started the class, was kind of a Mediterranean, Northern African movement. But now, with the rise of Islam and the fall of Rome, everything kind of moves north. And we meet a number of theologians of this period, but one of the very significant ones is Anslem. And he's a fascinating guy. So we'll just mention a few things about him in view of you reading two things from him. That is Why God Became Man, his famous book there. And then the other thing to read is a short piece called A Meditation on Human Redemption. One of the things that you will find that marks this period is that theologians easily, fluidly cross the boundaries of rigorous academic and devotional and spiritual. So there was not a line, not a division between that which was rigorous study and good for the passing tests and the academy, and that which was good to feed your soul. They were considered sort of one and the same. If you were to go back in time and ask somebody, talk to Anselm and say, "Hey, are you the kind of guy who is going to make sure you're all theologically right and be very rigorous in your logic and thought and scour every sentence you write to make sure that it conforms to a rigorous standard? Or are you the kind of person who is spiritual and just moved by the Spirit in terms of your writing? Which kind of person are you?" Anselm would look very confused, because he would say, "What distinction are you making?" That would not be a distinction that he would understand. So anyway, that's the reason why what I've designed for you are two things by the same person. One that's going to emphasize the rigorous logic of his writing, and the other that is going to be more meditative, as in the title, Meditations on Human Redemption. And the point is to see that, yes, these two may sound different, but in Anselm's mind, in the thinking back then, there was not a conscious distinction between these two different kinds of works, these two different realities. Well, let me just take you a little bit through Anselm in terms of the highlights of his life and how he came to write this work, and a few things to know about it. First, what dates are we looking at? Well, he was born around 1033 and died around 1109. Lived a good, healthy life there. He was educated in a school in Paris. Now, around this time, it's prior to the universities. We're going to see the rise of the universities is a very significant factor in the history of Europe. We'll look at that next week, Lord willing, as we talk about Thomas Aquinas. Universities changed everything. And in fact, and this is anticipating next week's, but just to sort of kind of give you the sense of where we are, prior to the universities and kind of where we're dealing with now, you have Northern Europe is not very advanced. It's not very advanced educationally, even though you might read these guys and say, wow, they're smart. This was not where the center of learning was happening. The center of learning was still in the South, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, but it was largely controlled by Islam. The Islamic scholars were the best scholars around this time. They were the ones who got all the libraries. They had the access to the writings of Aristotle and others. So the Islamic scholars were the ones who were really carrying the day in terms of scholarship. Christianity was this more of a backwoods kind of thing in Northern Europe. Yes, you read Anselm and you're like, wow, this guy's smart. But he would not have been, in terms of the global scene, he would not have been a top scholar. This is prior to the universities. Islam is the dominant culture. China also being very dominant in terms of technology. Europe is not at all a force to be reckoned with, it would seem. After the universities, all that began to change. And there is something very distinctly Christian about the way the university actually developed. And not to say that everything in there was entirely right and good. Oh, there were problems, there was corruption, but something about that idea that we're going to have a unity in the midst of diversity, which is where the term university comes from, a unity in diversity that's going to bring various disciplines together and put them under the same rubric. That is a distinctly Christian idea. And so the universities developed in the 12, 13, 1400s. That's not yet, though. We're not there yet. That'll be next week. We'll look at Thomas Aquinas as a prime example of university scholarship. We are in the realm of the pre-university scholarship, which would have been cathedral schools. They anticipate the university, but they're not there yet. A cathedral school is basically a school attached to a church. It's a church school. And again, how do we get to the universities? What happened is that you have these church schools that are there to train pastors, right? All these little faith seminaries sort of around, attached to large churches that can give a place of scholarship for would-be pastors and monks and missionaries. We're quite familiar how that would work. But they're the only things going. So imagine a world where you have a bunch of faith seminaries attached to these churches and no Towson universities or Morgan State universities or Johns Hopkins. They don't have that. They just have these religious schools. Now, if you are a wealthy or landowner, noble person, and you want your sons, they didn't do education to women back then, but if you want your sons to be educated to go into politics or law or something like that, you would want to send them to one of these religious schools because that was the only schooling around, and because that is how they would learn their logic and their rhetoric and their Latin. It would be through these schools. So this is an age where you have these cathedral schools and where you have a mix of people training for ministry in those schools and people training that they're still learning a religious curriculum, but they're not necessarily training for a religious education. So that's the thought world behind Anslem. He is educated in one of these cathedral schools. His school, though, is still a little bit different than the normal one because his is tied to a monastery rather than a church. Now, he enters into this school, this cathedral school, in the year 1056. It becomes very apparent that he is smarter than his professors. And he debated whether he would stay there for very long or whether he would go somewhere else. He chose to stay there, and within not many years he goes from being a student to being the lead teacher. So that's very quickly he rises to the top there, and they let him teach. He also joins the monastic order, so he is a monk. He is a person writing spiritual works, studying, praying. That is his profession. So he is in the monastic order at this cathedral school. Now, there is a story, a long story, behind how he moves from studying and teaching at this monastic school in Paris to becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. Now, along the way, you have to realize that England, it was, England is an island, right? And it's off the coast of Europe. And that means that while it is part of Europe and cannot be understood independently of what's going on in Europe, right? It's very much part of Europe. But at the same time, that I think 23 miles of the English Channel that separates England from France has a huge impact on how things travel over to England. And the Pope at this time, growing in power, is never really able to exert his influence on England as much as he would like to. There's always, he's much easier to exert his influence through the Holy Roman Empire, unless they're turning against him and doing things like kidnapping him. But as long as the relationship is okay, it's much easier for him to extend his influence in Europe, right? Because he can get there he can send his people there much more easily. It's much harder for him to exert influence in England, and the people in England are always a little bit more of independent thinkers than the rest of Europe. So it's harder for him to extend his influence there. Anslem ends up, though, becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, which means he is the highest ranking religious officer, you could say, in England. And there's a struggle between the church and state related to who has power. He is basically caught up in that struggle, and although he's an academic and a good one at that, would like to just write and teach and do that, he gets just pulled into church-state politics, and he gets exiled various times. It doesn't go well for him in terms of that struggle. Nevertheless, in and through that, he produced amazing, wonderful works, two of which you're reading. The first, Why God Became Man, is just probably what he's known the most for. He wrote this in 1098. Now, a few things to understand about this work. Again, as I said before, it is a work that is attempting to be rigorously academic, and yet it is devotional. It is written to encourage you in your relationship with God by being a meditation on the necessity for Christ to become man. Now, the context in which this is written, a couple things. One is there is apologetics going on between the church and Judaism. Okay, so there are outreaches to the Jewish people, and there are a number of conversions. So there are successful missions to the Jewish people, and when they're debating with the Jewish people, when they're bringing the gospel to the Jewish people, they're pushing this issue of Jesus as God, and that God had to become man in the person of Christ. So they're pushing this issue with success, and that is one of the reasons why this issue is something that is talked about quite often. And Anslem is weighing in on this subject because he cares about it, because Christians are thinking about why God became man, to just encourage themselves and to evangelize their Jewish neighbors. Now, I want you to notice a transition that has gone on. If you look at the church fathers, remember we looked at Athanasius and the Nicene Creed and the Council of Chalcedon and all that, and the debate with Arius, Nestorius, Eutyches. A lot of that was dealing with the question, you could put it this way, how God became man. So how did he do it? How did the person-nature distinction work? How did he assume human flesh? The question is how. And that was the question that preoccupied the church fathers' time. Now we're moving into Middle Ages. It's a different conception, different thought world, different issues. Obviously, same Christianity, same text of the Bible. But now the question isn't so much how, the question is why, which represents a bit deeper, more philosophical framework. We're not just wanting to repeat the same theology that the church fathers had said. We're wanting to examine their presuppositions. We're wanting to think about their assumptions. Why are they saying this? Not just what are they saying, why are they saying this? And we don't want to just repeat what they said, but we want to reflect on it at a little bit more of a deeper level. So that's what's going on here with the title and in this whole work. Now, what you have to understand here too is the issue of feudalism. So this is a feudal context. Now, feudalism is kind of this. It's a lot like slavery, although there are important distinctions. I think there's a lot more dignity that is afforded and respect that is given to the individual in a feudalistic society. But with feudalism, you would have, this is how Europe worked during the feudal period, you would have these like knights, these landowners, these noble people, who would have this land. One person would own a lot of land, and they would have people, work that land, but not as slaves, nor as employees. It was this mix. They would have so they would have people to work this land. And those people were entered into sort of this contract with the owners. So you're the owner of this land. I think of him as like living in a castle on top of a hill, something like that. Um, you see remnants of it if you've watched the TV show Downton Abbey, where you have the big house, and then there's all this village that's sort of part of their great estate. These now, that time period is much different than what we're dealing here with the feudal period, but nevertheless, there's some remnants of it that's still actually there, where you have the rich landowner who owns this, like a county worth of land, will have responsibility for those who are under their care. There will be this sense that they are the ones who is responsible for their welfare. And there was this sort of there was this contract. So this arrangement where the vassals, those who are underneath the landowner, the lord, the vassals owed things to their lord. They owed some sense of obedience, loyalty, respect. They should not go and be traitors to another lord. They shouldn't take all the Lord's secrets and bring them and expose them before the world. They had to be loyal. They had to give a portion of their income to the Lord. That they owed them some money. The Lord was letting them work their land, so there was a sense where they had a responsibility to support the Lord. But the Lord, and here this is different than something like the raw slavery in the American South. The Lord had responsibility toward the vassals. So the vassals could expect the Lord to be fair, to be just. The vassals could expect the Lord that if they died, the Lord would see to it that their children were raised up in a way that showed them dignity and respect. The vassals could expect the Lord to give them some sense of protection, to give them land to work. So there was this bilateral agreement. It wasn't simply slavery, but neither was it the case where the vassals were sat equal to their lords. No, it was a feudal society. They couldn't just go away to another place to work. They couldn't do that. Unless the vassal had broken the contract by not providing for them something that ought to have been provided. Then the vassal could legitimately walk away, and that would be okay. There would not be a punishment. So that was the feudal system, bilateral contract. It's a very much a honor-shame culture, okay? So what was necessary for this whole thing to work is that the Lord was shown a certain degree of honor and respect. So if one of the vassals did something that disrespected the Lord, started gossiping about him or something like that, I don't know, what would then happen? Well, the problem would be that the Lord's honor had been broken, impinged upon. The honor had been, there was not proper honor, not fitting honor to the Lord. What was going to be the result? Well, if it's a serious enough charge, gossip wouldn't have been, but you could imagine a case where it would be very serious. The Lord could require the vassal's death, even. The Lord was the judge and jury here. Okay, so the Lord is the government. He can do what he wants. But interestingly, there was also a high value on mercy, and it was more fitting for the honor of the Lord not to actually require the death of the vassal, unless it was a very egregious crime. If the vassal murders the lord's son, obviously that would require the vassal's death. But in lesser offenses, where the lord could require death or something extremely severe, that usually wouldn't happen. Usually there would be just enough of a punishment to restore the honor of the Lord. So the question was, what is necessary to restore the honor of the Lord? And that's the degree of punishment that they would seek out. Now, why do I take a while to explain all that? Well, the answer is that is basically the thought world, the conception, the worldview behind which Anslem is asking and answering the question, why did God become man? So he is showing that God became man in a particular context where his goal is, the goal of Christ, is to restore God's honor. So we're not looking at a strict sense of justice, of right and wrong. We're looking at how does God restore his honor so that, like the Lord, who would not want to punish and destroy the people unless absolutely necessary, but nevertheless can't give up his honor, like that Lord of the vassal state, what does God do in order to restore his honor as God? And the answer is, he, in the person of Christ, the second person of the Trinity, becomes man and then is able to do something that will show the egregious nature of sin, to show the people that they have messed up and messed up bad, and yet in such a way that restores honor to God while not destroying the people. So the question, why did God become man, is answered in that feudal context. I've mentioned it a little bit actually in the Salvation 3 class, if you're in that one or have been in that one, where we talked about how this is a view of the atonement that doesn't see the death of Christ as absolutely necessary. Hypothetically, God could have decided to save the human race and not chosen to save his son, to send his son to actually die on the cross. It wasn't absolutely necessary for God to have done it this way in order to redeem the human race, those who are elect within the human race. It wasn't necessary for him to send his son and do it that way. But it was the most fitting way. It was the way that made the most sense given the demand for God to preserve his honor. So we've already talked about it that way, and Anslem is one of the prime examples of a view of the atonement, a view that I actually do not think is correct. Nevertheless, historically, this is important for us to study. Anslem is one of the prime examples of a view of the atonement that does not take the death on the cross to be absolutely necessary, but rather takes it to be the most fitting, the most logical, the best way for God to have done it. Incidentally, I think that Anslem's wrong here. I think we should look at it actually as absolutely necessary. Now, God did not have to he did not have to redeem anybody. He could have left us all to just die in our sins, and he would have been completely just. Nevertheless, in his mercy and grace, he decides to save people. But having decided to save people, he has to send his son to die on the cross, because there is no other way that people can be redeemed outside of the death of Christ on the cross. I think that highlights God's love, right? Because God loved the world that he sent his son to die. He didn't have to, if he didn't have to do it, how would that really been an act of love? It rather becomes, like in Anslem's theology, a way that God is showing and displaying his honor. And I don't think that that is the accent of the cross that we see in the pages of the New Testament. Rather, we see that the cross is an act of love because it is necessary. Anyway, that's just a little bit of a critique on Anslem's theology. Nevertheless, his book, Why God Became Man, which you'll read just an excerpt of, is just incredibly useful and helpful. And even though he doesn't see the cross as absolutely necessary, he still sees it as most fitting, and therefore says many things that I think are extremely helpful for us to reflect on and think through. So there you have it. Just a little bit of introduction regarding Anslem's his life, his work, what he is. I hope you will enjoy this, and I look forward to reading your thoughts and engaging with you in the discussion.